So as Jade said, today I'm going to be sharing aspects of what turned into a 19-year journey. It was never planned out that way. It ran from the late 90s till a couple of years ago, which led me into Central Australia and the Western Desert and resulted in the publication of my book, Master from Marnpi. Master from Marnpi being Mick Namarari Tjapaltjarri, a Pintupi man from the Western Desert who became an award-winning Pintupi artist. The book is available in some bookshops. It's also available online. And as a little thank you for those of you coming along today, if you'd like a copy of the book for yourself or for a friend for early Christmas presents, when you order online, there's a box called a discount code box. And if you put the word bookworms, that's one word, bookworms, into that code box, it reduces the shipping to $0. So make sure that happens because that saves $17. So that might help you today. That'd be great.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Alec. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the library's already got a copy, so you've got yours on your shelf, so you're doing fine. But for everybody else, yeah, if you want a copy of the book for yourself, I said for a friend, because if you know someone interested who wants to learn more about Aboriginal art or art and history of a particular region, in this case, geographically, we're talking about the Western Desert, culturally, we're talking about Pintupi people, the book might be one way to do that. I'll also mention today, at least I hope I remember to, a few resources that will be of interest for you, those of you who want to do some further study. Obviously, my talk today is a rather rapid run through a lot of information, but I'll mention some resources I've found useful. It's just a list. There's some books, a couple of documentaries and so on. And if you want a copy of that, just email me. You'll see my email pop up soon. Email me and I'll just send you the list and you can chase up the things that you would like. If you're in Melbourne and you wanted to see the book, you can go to the PMI library. That's just a quick ad. Thumbs up from Jade. So that's the resources. Also, I've got to add another note today. When this session was planned several months ago, we didn't know the date of the referendum. I'm aware that some of you may have some thoughts in your mind about the impending referendum, given that it's coming up soon. So I'm not going to try and adjust my talk today in relation to the referendum. I'll let that sit. But I've written a short essay about how I've come to my decision about the referendum and how I'm voting. It's just a 2-page essay, and if you want a copy of that, you can ask for that, and I'll email you my essay as well. One of the resources I'll particularly mention, in fact, now I'll mention two. Two of the resources I'll particularly mention is, if you want to see Namarari talking about his life in particular and the history of the Pintupi people, there's a documentary called Benny and the Dreamers. So that would be one to put on your list. And if you want a slightly more academic version of today's, my story, then in the current Journal of Australian Biography and History, published by ANU Press, there's an author memoir in the current edition called The Road to Marnpi, which is an 8,000-word essay that I've written about the story we're doing today. So that's resources and introduction and I think everything, Jade. So shall I begin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Share your screen.
So what I'm going to do, folks, is I've got some slides. I'm going to go through a story which is partly my research journey and partly talking about Namarari's life and art. So to begin, in the mid-90s, when I was in my mid-40s, believe it or not, I didn't really know anything about Aboriginal art, history, culture, didn't get into school, didn't learn much growing up, and thought as an adult white Australian male, I should ought to learn something. And so informally, I started going to Aboriginal art exhibitions, started to meet people in Sydney, go to the Public Gallery, go to Utopia Art Sydney, which was a Pintupi representative in Sydney of their art from Western Desert. Eventually went to Alice Springs. My first trip into the Pintupi Gallery in Alice Springs to meet marvellous manager Daphne Williams. I was told that a fellow had been in there just 10 minutes ago who you might have liked to have met. His name was Mick Namarari. He was just in Alice Springs doing some business. He'd called in, but he'd left 10 minutes ago. I didn't think at the time how I wished I'd been 10 minutes earlier, but that's as close as I got to Namarari. He passed away the following year. So my interest in Aboriginal art generally kind of focused in on that Central Australia, Western Desert, and in fact Kimberley in WA regions. And because I got interested in the Western Desert artists, the group of old men from several language groups who ended up, by quirks of history, being at Papunya in the early 70s and starting to paint. And most of you, I suspect, would know that story. It's a kind of well-known story in the development of Aboriginal art. I got interested in that group of old men, where they came from, why they were there. So that led me into colonisation stories and so on. And I became attracted to Namarari more than the others, and thought if I write a little story about his life, nothing too long, nothing too complicated, it shouldn't take too long, and within a year or two, that little project would be off my hands. So that project started in 1999 and it finished in 2018. So it did turn into a journey. And certainly for me, it involved reconciliation, because I really never knew any Aboriginal people. I knew some, not many. I hadn't really engaged with issues in relation to white Australia and Aboriginal history or colonisation. Lived in middle-class Perth when I grew up. You know, that part of Australia was a foreign country to me. So then off I went. So let's leave a summary of my story and go through a story where I can bring you some pictures. I'm going to press that one. And
Perfect.
am I on track here, Jade?
Yep. Yeah. Screen looks exactly how it should.
Okay, the screen looks how it should. What a marvel. So this is just an introductory screen. There's a picture of Namarari taken in 1997 by Paul Sweeney, who's the Papunya staff member out at Kintor, which is an Aboriginal, now it's an Aboriginal community, only started in the 1980s. And that picture shows you a very old and weary man who by then had a lot of knowledge in that head of his, as you can imagine, but it was also having some health problems at the time, and yet he was still painting. And you'll see the painting that he did that very day as we go towards the end of this presentation, because behind him is the painting, even though it's out of focus. So we're going to get to that. Okay, I kept talking about Central Australia and the Western Desert, but here's a map. I like maps. I'm not showing you many today, but here's an important one. Some of you will recognise this as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages map of Australia. These maps are available. Every school should have one. Every library should have one in your home. And I'm pointing to that large greenish block, which is notionally Pintupi country. And you can see that in the desert, the little blocks of colour are much bigger compared to the smaller bits of colour around the edge of the continent. That tells you something about weather and availability of food and what populations can be sustained in different topographies. So that's Pintupi country. And then in the book, there's a double-page spread. So you'll see on the left-hand page, there's a little, what do you call that? A dotted box, bit of a rectangle. And that's the main area. And well, it shows where Namarari was born, where he mainly travelled as a child. We did a lot of travel as an adult, excuse me. And on the right-hand side of the right-hand page is Alice Springs. And in the middle of the left-hand page, where that dotted line is, being the border between the Northern Territory and WA, is that community of Kintor. So from Alice Springs out to Kintor is about 500 kilometres. Most of it's gravel. I've driven that back and forth many times. And in between, there are some settlements like Hermansburg, Undaria, Papunya, Mount Liebig and Kintore, and over in WA, Kirikura, all by itself, top left, has a reputation as the most remote Aboriginal community in Australia. And there's lots of smaller places listed, the names of which more than likely you haven't seen and aren't at all familiar with because they're not on most maps. They're Aboriginal sites of significance: waterholes, rock holes, springs, rock formations. And of course, you would probably know that they're all linked into cultural stories, what some people call the dreaming, which is more properly Jukapa, which is the whole philosophy and inherited knowledge system that people live within and live under. So many of those places on that map are places in Namarari's paintings because that's where the dreaming stories exist in place. And many of those places I've been to, and we're going to visit some. So there's a map of where we are territory. And I should say, whilst Namarari spent most of his time there, including being a stockman and an artist and a parent and so on, he also went to the Tiwi Islands in the 1960s to work in forestry, courtesy of the Native Welfare Department under the assimilation policy. In the 80s and 90s, he went to Adelaide, he went to Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney, courtesy of his art career. So he was by no means an isolated person who didn't have awareness of the marketplace and broader society. It's just that he didn't prefer it. So if we drive out on that gravel road and get to Kintore, 500 k's west of Alice Springs, there's an official welcoming sign, and then some of the local lads have made another sign, which I thought was pretty gorgeous, on an old car bonnet, "Welcome to Kintore." And underneath their painted "Welcome to Kintore," you can see a kind of a black and reddish brownish mountain range. And in the distance, there is the mountain range. If you drive into Kintore, you'll see the Men's Mountain to the south. And that is the Nintaka, the Parenti dreaming, the part of the inheritance of that particular place. And off screen, just to the east or the left-hand side, is the Women's Mountain. So when you're in Kintore, the community's got houses and shops and a dialysis service and an arts centre and a school and a church and people's housing and an airstrip and power supply and so on. No matter where you are, you look to the south to see the Men's Mountain, you look to the east to see the Women's Mountain. So let's head out of Kintore. We're going southeast out of Kintore on a rather nice gravel road on a sunny day, and plenty of shrubs and spinifex around. So I'm heading out down to Marnpi, about 3/4 of an hour or an hour's drive. And Marnpi is the place where Namarari was born. So Marnpi is Nyakunyura, my country. Now, we're in the realms of where he was born. Marnpi itself is not a region, it's a rock hole. So Marnpi is a small rock hole, enough for a person to literally step into. It's on a flat rock shelf. It's between sandhills. And it's between some of the sandhills near where we were, though we didn't get to it specifically. It was probably covered in vegetation, to be honest, because it's not attended to these days the way it might have been. And of course, country changes over time. So we're standing on a bit of a sandhill there. You can see the vegetation's what I think was pretty good. So I think there'd been rain in recent years. In a drought, this would look very different. So we're down in desert country. Nearby to Marnpi, which is a kangaroo dreaming place of particular importance, is another place called Nyunman, which is a dingo dreaming place for Namarari. And I'm standing on a rocky ridge, halfway up the ridge. I'm looking down across this plain, and you can see in the midst of those very bright white trees, a couple of dwellings. So these dwellings were built in the 1980s, and this is Namarari's outstation. So a huge part of the history that you can't escape if you dig into it from the 60s through the 70s into the early 80s is what they call the homelands or outstations movement. particularly for Pintupi people, but for others as well in other regions. They wanted to get out of Papunya. Why they were there is another story. And so through government support, outstation dwellings were built on traditional country for different families so they could live where they wanted to live. There were pluses and minuses about that, quite frankly. I think the men loved it because they were on country, very familiar. They loved to go hunting. Namarari would just walk off with his dogs and his shotgun and go for goannas, kangaroos, wallabies, whatever. But for women and children, there was a sense of isolation. So it wasn't as easy to be away from the community hub where health services and school services and social networks, etc., were available. Anyway, that's where Namarari lived. And if we think about him as an artist, one of the questions you're probably thinking is, well, where did he paint? Where was his studio? This was one of his studios. And I might even have a picture of it, I think. So he painted at Papunya because that's where the painting movement began. He painted at his outstation. There's yours truly. So this is trekking around in the desert. That photo behind me has some lovely desert oaks. Desert oaks are pretty amazing trees. You can see some very thin ones to the right of my right shoulder. They're hardly noticeable. When a desert oak puts down a taproot, it keeps going and going and going. And if it doesn't find water, the tree dies. If it finds water, it literally taps into it and becomes a mature tree. So if there's a grove of desert oaks, there's a message. What's underneath? Water.
Exactly. Then you know there's water there.
You know there's water there. So who did I go out there with? Well, on one of my trips was with these fellas. So the man on the right-hand side with pretty wild hair is Tommy Conway Japanati. He's one of Namarari's grandsons. He's a bit of a character. So he was my leader on the day, which is to say in my hired four-wheel drive, once we've been to the shop and got some goodies, he gets a couple of his mates and we just go. So we had an interesting day out exploring, and the range up in the background behind me is that range I walked up to take the photograph, looking back down over those houses. So I used to think, don't ask me why, that the desert was flat and lifeless. So it's not flat and it's not lifeless. It's challenging. I think it's a harsh teacher. But there's hills, there's ranges, there's different sorts of vegetation, there's rock holes, there's places for animals to live and hide, there's foods, there's water if you know where to look. But it's a place you have to grow up in, I think, to have any understanding of. On another trip out to that same region, I went, there's my hired four-wheel drive, patiently waiting. I went with Elizabeth Marks Nakamara and her family. So Elizabeth is Namarari's widow. He was married twice. And Elizabeth and Namarari had 3 children. And one of the 2 folks there is her adult daughter with her husband. So we went on when I went to Kintor to do research, of course, I would meet Elizabeth. She was my helper for this research. She was my support person. She was my advisor. And she was also a dialysis patient. I didn't know much about dialysis. So for those of you who don't, you might want to find out about the Purple House, which is the headquarters in Alice Springs of the Western Desert Nanapiwal Tjapaltjarri Judiku Aboriginal Corporation. But if you just remember Purple House, you'll have it. So that's the service started by Pintupi people, self-determination, to provide services that they needed on their country. And Elizabeth is a dialysis patient. So one day she would do dialysis and the next day she'd be free. Next day dialysis, next day free. Next day dialysis, next day free. So when I arrived in Kintor, I'd go and see Elizabeth and I'd say, Elizabeth, what's our schedule? And she'd say, today dialysis, tomorrow bush picnic. So we would head off, and we are near Kintor at a place called Putja. Putja is a 2 women dreaming site. So sites in country are different. So here's one. You can see I'm standing on a rocky shelf raised above the ground. It just comes out of the ground quite literally. Even you can see that from that shot. It's about, I'm going to say 20 or 30 metres across, a couple of metres high. It's got a very weathered surface, you can see there. And the grooves in the rock formation, when it rains, flows the water, obviously, into certain directions, and it coalesces and gravitates to a couple of kind of inbuilt containers, which are next to that rather greenish tree you can see in the middle of the picture. So this two women dreaming place, the two women dreaming story goes for hundreds of kilometres across the land, connecting one place to another. And it'll intersect. Remember I said at Marnpi is the two kangaroo dreaming place. So the two kangaroo dreaming place, it will travel across the land as well. And some of these stories will intersect at a given place. And there'll be men's and women's stories at a certain place. There'll be particular things at that site which connect to that particular Jukaba, that dreaming narrative, in ways that are very complex. And I don't know them, so it's not like I'm keeping them secret. They're beyond my comprehension. They're for people who grow up in that culture and spend 20 or 30 or 40, 50 years learning about that sort of thing. But Elizabeth would introduce me to country. We'd go and get some bush tucker. We'd have a picnic. We'd have some looking around. I'd collect some firewood for them. We'd have a nice day out. I'm going to jump from Kintore over to Mount Liebig, which is a bit closer to Alice Springs. It's another community started by Aboriginal people in the 70s. Pintupi and Luritja people mainly. And I'm standing on the side of a hill, and in front of me, rather nondescript, you can see a little puddle of water. The water's a bit grubby actually. So this is a natural spring called Patati Spring. And you get a hint of the fact that there's water underneath by the luxurious tree that's behind me. So Patati Spring is an important place in Pintupi contemporary history. One, because it's a permanent supply of water. So in drought times, people would coalesce to springs, permanent springs, which means lots of people would be concentrated in a certain place because you can't survive without water, lesson number one. And then they would disperse if the rains came. But Patati was also the place where Namarari first encountered white people when he was a boy, 8 or 9 years old, I'm estimating. I think he was born about 1923. He passed away in the late 90s, age 75. So when he was 8 or 9 years old, through rather tragic circumstances, he ended up here at Patati Spring, and the missionaries from Hermannsburg, hundreds of kilometres away, Lutheran missions and their Aboriginal evangelists used to come out here to make contact with these desert nomads to introduce them to Christianity, which of course would save them from a fate worse than who knows what. Anyway, that's part of the contact story that Namarari was involved in, and he talks about it in those interviews that he did in Pintupi, and those stories are in the book, and they're fascinating. How did I get out to Patati Springs? Well, it's okay to drive out through Aboriginal communities because you're on public roads, but if you get off those roads and want to go to places beyond those roads, then you don't without permission. So one of the residents at Mount Liebig, Mr. Leo Peterson Jampajimpa, who's here next to me, this is at the end of that day that we went out to Patati Spring, and we went to other places as well. We went to Marnpi and Arantchi and other places that are in Namarari's story of his life as a boy and growing up. So Leo is another grandson of Namarari, and but in fact through Namarari's first wife, not Elizabeth, his second wife, which is why he's clearly an adult. Leo was another dialysis patient as well. So every second day for Leo was dialysis. The thing you notice about Leo is he's a footy fan, and he was a big fan of the St Kilda Saints, which is a football team in Melbourne, and he always wore his Saints football cap. So everyone in Western Desert communities has a footy team, and one of the biggest occasions of the year is the regional football weekends, long weekends, where all the towns come together, football teams play against each other. I think the girls' netball teams play against each other. There's rock bands at night. Everybody sees each other. It's a crazy time. As well as going out bushing, having a good time, being a researcher, I was spending time in archives. So everyone who's done research knows about the joy of sitting in archives day after day. Here I'm obviously looking very happy, so that must have been a good day. So I did archival research in pretty much all capital cities, as well as on computers, national archives, Northern Territory archives, libraries and so on. I can tell you for sure that every person who works in archive centres or libraries is incredibly helpful and loves helping people who are looking for information. So I always had a great time and lots of support. Now, here's a jump. This has been my last 19 years of trying to comprehend a man who I didn't meet and trying to get a bit of an understanding of his life. This wonderful photo I found in an archive in South Australia Museum from 1932. So the man who took this photograph is a travelling missionary, and he's on the back of a camel. So this is about 1932 at near Mount Liebig. Look at the range in the background, where I was with Leo going out to some of those water holes nearby. To cut a very long story short, there was a big study in 1932 at Mount Liebig by a scientific expedition from Adelaide, and they went out there and they met and measured and photographed a lot of Aboriginal people. But this tells you, in a sense, how people travelled. So Namari is not in this picture, at least not to my knowledge. I doubt that he is. But about this time, he was an 8 or 9-year-old boy. This is how people travelled. Extended family, Walcher. There's some men up the front who seem to me to be collecting firewood or looking for something. Hunting, perhaps. There's a number of adult women. There's a couple of teenage-aged people, I think, and there's some children. One child at the back's getting a piggyback. One child's on probably mum or dad's shoulders. People are walking as a group. So the thing is, of course, that these people knew this country so intimately, and through what sometimes these days are still referred to as foot walking. So how did Namarari get to know Marnpi and Yunman and Warrington? Foot walking is the answer. And, you know, driving is just too fast. You can't learn anything driving. So foot walking was how people learned. And of course, these kids, think of these kids in 10 years' time without colonisation, if they'd walk past this same place 20 times. Each time learning something. Okay, when Namarari was a child, that's what he was doing. When he was initiated in his teenage years, so initiation is the transformation from the boy to the man. It's not, what's the word? It's not gradual in the sense that it's some kind of a slow transition. It's transformation. You were a boy, you're a man. Finished being a child, it's gone, past. So one of the things that men need to learn, apart from what we might call more esoteric cultural knowledge, is how to make tools. So a man has to be a hunter. He has to care for his family. So he's got to learn to make spears, boomerangs, shields, and so on. This is a boomerang made by Namarari, but not in his early days. This is from 1983. He made this for sale through Papanatula. It's a beautiful object. You can see it's had ochre rubbed on it to give it a smooth, lovely reddish surface. It's very nicely finished. And he's actually decorated it with, if you have a close look, it's just black stripes and white dots, not complicated, and made for sale. I I got attracted to his boomerang because I learned how to make a boomerang once. I made one boomerang. It took me months. It was incredibly difficult. I had a very good teacher. And one of the things I learned was in making a boomerang is you have to have amazing concentrated hand-eye coordination. If you let that file or chisel or axe slip, then you have a very bad accident. Now, traditionally, of course, they were made with stone axes. I can't comprehend how men made wooden objects using traditional stone materials, because I had a metal tomahawk and a chisel. Anyway, it was a great education for me, and I learned by inference that Namarari had extraordinary hand-eye coordination. Let's jump to some paintings. Here's one of his paintings from the early 70s when he started painting. This is a kangaroo story. There's two sets of opposing arcs, 3 arcs on each side. There's a lot of dotting. There's a lot of infill. He didn't say much about what this story is about, but I do know from one of my advisors that sometimes if a kangaroo is sitting on the ground in the sand, in the shade, and the kangaroo moves a little bit to follow the shade and then moves a little bit more, the big arc of its back can leave a mark in the sand. It might be that those marks indicate the presence of the kangaroo. So Namarari hasn't painted a kangaroo, but he's said it's there. Here's a kangaroo story again from 1987. And can I check that you can see the top right-hand corner of the certificate on the right-hand side? So it's, mine's covered over. That's okay by the little pictures of people. So the painting on the left is also two kangaroo dreaming. And the certificate says it depicts the rock-hole side of Marnpi. Well, we kind of went to Marnpi, didn't we? That sandhill country, southeast of Kintor. And it says in mythological times, the two kangaroo dreaming travelled to Marnpi and so on. And then they can't say any more because it's secret sacred. So to me, what Namarari is representing there in the middle of the painting is that constricted, how it comes in and kind of constricts. To me, that's the constriction showing Marnpi in between the sandhills. On the top right, my memory serves me well, that number is MN 871169, because I can't see it because it's covered over. So MN stands for Mick Namarari. This is the cataloguing system used by Papanjatula. So every painting's identified. People interested in provenance will want to know about this. So MN is Mick Namarari. 87 is 1987. 11 is the 11th month of the year, November. And 69 is that it was the 69th painting catalogued that month. It might have been the last one. There might have been 10 more. So each painting has a certificate number from Papanjatula going right back until 1972, late 1972, when the Papanjatula Artists Organisation was established by several men, including Namarari. And it still exists today. And it has its studios at Kintor and at Kurikura. They're the two predominant Pintupi communities out in the Western Desert. And Papanjatula's administrative centre and gallery is in Alice Springs. So here's a way of looking at another studio. Remember we said Namarari painted at his outstation. He painted in Kintor. So this is another double-page spread from the book. So each chapter opens on a double page. It's chronological. So in this part of the book, we're up to the 1980s. And the chapter was called Return, Rebuild and Resettle. And in 1983, though he was living out at Kintor, he also spent a lot of time at Mount Levy because he had relatives there, especially Elizabeth's family. And he might visit Papunya because he'll have relatives there. And here he is at Papunya, and you may have heard of Aboriginal humpies. This is a humpy. This is what he might live in for several days. It's kind of transportable. It's breakable, downable. It's puttable, uppable. One of his dogs is nearby. He loved his dogs, always had his dogs. There's a sheet of corrugated iron with a metal drum next to the entrance of the humpy. Elizabeth told me that's to keep the dogs out so they don't get your food. And he's painting. The last night's campfire is spent. He's got his hat next to him on the ground, which tells me that the photographer must have encouraged him to take his hat off because he didn't like taking his hat off, especially on a sunny day. So he could be posing or he could be finishing that painting, but he's working on a painting outdoors. So for that day, that's his studio. Namarari could kind of paint anywhere, is the impression I got. So there's several pictures of his studios in the book. Here's that one I mentioned before. So we're back to the outstation at Nyunman, looking down from the ridge. There was those little houses in there. So this is his outstation dwelling. You can see it's a solid brick house with a solid metal roof. These houses were well constructed. They were well set up for permanent living, as much as that's possible in an isolated setting. And each of them had a veranda like this, and Namarari would paint here. So he kept his paints up out of the way from dogs and kids. And if it was winter, he'd have a little fire going nearby. He'd love to sit by the fire. So there'd be smoke and fire and kids running around and dogs lazing beside him. And he would paint perhaps half a day, and then in the afternoon he'd head off with his dogs and try and get something for dinner, or just as importantly, get away from kids who wanted something and have a break. Back in Kintore, these old sheds are part of history, significant art history. So the small shed on the left was built in the 1980s by Papanjatula, or provided to them, one of those statements is true. And it was used for storage of art materials because the Papanjatula art staff, driving all the way from Alice Springs, couldn't keep bringing materials back and forth. It was a bit too much. So the storage shed was used to store materials. And in the 90s, the building on the right-hand side was added, a couple of bedrooms and a little mini kitchen and a bathroom. So Papanjatula staff could stay in Kintore for a couple of weeks at a time, look after the artists, gather all the paintings, put all those numbers on them, help prepare information for the certificates and so on, have a bit of a base. So that building on the left, just generally referred to as the painting shed, was where in the 90s Namarari painted a lot. And subsequently, when Papanjatula built a brand new studio in 2007, that old shed was demolished. Boo-hoo. Here's another double-page spread from the book. Namarari's painting on the left-hand side, and he's in that painting shed. You can see a bit of the sign in the top right-hand corner of that photo. So he's finishing off a large painting. He's got his hat on. Remember I said he likes his hat. And the painting on the right-hand side is the picture that he's making, and here it is. So this is a mouse dreaming story, Junanpa Jukapa, for a site near Kintore. And at first glance, it doesn't look like a mouse dreaming because I can't see any animal forms, and it's hard to interpret strictly as landscape because there seems to be no horizon or specific topographical kind of symbols that we might expect. The dots in these paintings for Namarari were the berries that the little mouse, and the mouse was only like that big, was 30 grams was the weight of the mouse, 1 ounce. It used to hop around and collect little berries called akajiri or kamparapa, two language versions of the same berry. And it would collect the kamparapa and scurry back to its little home beneath the spinifex because they live under the ground. So for Namarari, he said the dots were the berries that the animal ate and its little footprints, the little indentations in the sand. Beyond that, Namarari, when he was doing these paintings, just kind of got lost in his own world. And I think apart from being something representative, that is the story of the mouse, they were a kind of a meditation escape for him to just get into his own world, because He was incredibly slow with his painting. And in fact, when you look at a close-up of that painting in the centre, what can you notice? Well, one of the things you can notice that the dots are quite discreet. Each dot's been placed, hasn't been rubbed, it hasn't been put down roughly, it's been placed carefully. And I've looked at the surface of this painting. You virtually can't find any drips anywhere because he hasn't allowed for drips. He's carefully picked up his brush and kept moving. And there's a little line of white dots in the centre of the painting which seem to be kind of isolated, and we can ask forever what's the little line of white dots that have been left there. He sometimes did things, excuse me, which were a bit idiosyncratic. So everything about a painting would be the same, except there'd be one little pattern break. There'd be one little thing that was a bit different. And I think that's one of those things, although it's also been suggested, that could be a track, of the mouse going along through the desert. It could be any number of things. It could be a quirk. It's one of the things Namarari sometimes did with his paintings. And there he is painting his dots. He had very strong hands, incredibly strong hands for an otherwise not big man. And on the left-hand side, when I went out on one of those bush tucker trips, remember, with Elizabeth and her family, there was lots of akajiri, berries ripe on bushes. So here's a handful of the berries that Namarari's painting. And once you've seen the berries, you go, well, they're the dots. So berries and the dots, same thing for me anyway. And he's just taken a very particular and simple piece of the world around him, berries, and turn it into a painting. On a different scale, here's an amazing painting from the late 70s, and this is one of really his masterworks in the Burnt Museum in Perth. And you can see already there's a lot more iconography, a lot more symbols, a lot more things happening in this painting, just to give you an indication that, not all of his paintings are the same. So there's lots of those roundels, those sets of concentric circles. And in the annotation that goes with this painting, drawn up by the Papanyathula field worker, some of those places are identified by name. One of them is Marnpi, his birthplace. And some of the features within the painting are identified. Some of them are bush tucker. One of them is a rainbow. Some of them is men travelling. Some of them is women playing a women's game. And that painting is a double-page spread in the book with a transparent overlay with that annotated diagram marked out and pointing into the painting to indicate what those different symbols and forms are. It's a stunning painting to see in the flesh, let me assure you of that. Coming back into the 90s, as well as painting those very fine dot paintings, here he is painting bands of colour. This is a hare wallaby dreaming also from Marnpi. And when you look at the surface of this painting, and I don't think it'll show up in the picture, he hasn't just painted those broad bands with a broad brush and kind of filled them in like you do house painting. Each of them are made with a fine brush, and there's fine lines of paint. You can see the ridges of paint along within those dark bands. And there's that fine hand who can very carefully scrape along the side of a piece of timber to refine a boomerang to make it smoother and smoother and smoother without losing track of where he's up to. Again, a very striking painting in a completely different style by the same artist in the last year of his life. So he's still being inventive. Coming towards the end, and I need to because I'm running out of time. This is Elizabeth, and I asked her when I did the book if she would write a welcome, a little introduction, and on the left-hand side, we're sitting in Alice Springs at a hostel, and she's writing her introduction in Pintupi because I wanted a Pintupi opening, and she graciously obliged, and then an English translation. So that's in the beginning of the book. And then in our book launch in Alice Springs, we sat together and signed some books, which was great fun. Afterwards, I was able to give her copy of the book, and we chatted about that, and she was most interested in seeing some of the pictures that I dug up. And on the right-hand side is Fabian Peterson Nampijinpa, another of Namarari's granddaughters, who I gave a copy of the book to, and she read through and she was very pleased. All these people are very helpful, I have to tell you, very generous. And that, I think, means, if I get to that slide, it's the end of the story for today. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Alec. That was absolutely incredible, and it's quite clear how much his art and his life has impacted you. Because, as you said in the beginning, you expected it to be a, you know, 1-year journey, and you'll be done and finished with that project. And
yeah, move on.
Yeah, clearly not the case.
No, much more exciting.
Speaking of that, though, I was wondering, what was the turning point? Sorry, I'm going to jump in with my own question first, everybody. What was the turning point when you realized, no, I actually want to dedicate a lot more time to this idea, to this project? Yeah, what convinced you?
Perfect question. In 2007, I made my first trip to Kintor with a group of people going out for the opening of the new Pintupi art studio, which was quite an occasion, people from around the world, a huge occasion in the community. And that's where I first met Elizabeth Marks Nakamura, Namarari's widow, courtesy of being introduced by Daphne Williams. I talked to Elizabeth because I had, you know, I told her I've got this idea to write this story about her late husband, and would that be okay? And she was immediately supportive and started telling me stories about him and about when he painted. And that kind of gave me the impetus that I've got to really move on this, because, you know, there's a level of approval and support from Elizabeth. So I told her at the end of that conversation I would write a book about her husband, and I did. For everyone to see is what I told her. So that, once I'd said that to her, I thought, I can't go back on this now. So that, when I came back to Sydney, I was much more committed to have to follow through, which then led me to realising I couldn't keep doing it informally. So I went to ANU, Australian National University, and did a doctorate, a thesis, and then the thesis became the basis of the book. So a turning point was meeting Elizabeth and making a commitment to making the story happen. Good question.
Oh, I can tell that. Well, we're all thankful that you did, because it's absolutely stunning. Like, as you also said, just can look at some of his pieces and you can see the dots are all individual. Like, I've had a look at the book myself and I saw that spread and I just looked at it. It was absolutely beautiful, absolutely stunning. And of course, I didn't quite understand the stories behind it, but you could immediately tell the dedication and that something was being said. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And some of Namarari's paintings, for those of you who are watching today and in the near future, will be in an exhibition of Pintupi art at the Drill Hall Gallery in Canberra, beginning at the end of October and running through until mid-December. So not only Namarari's paintings, but a lot of his contemporaries as well, from the 1970s right up to the modern day. So people interested in Pintupi art, go to Canberra. Look at the Drill Hall Gallery website, they'll tell you. Thanks for that question, Jay, because that's an important turning point in the whole project.
No, my pleasure. And Ellen also has a question for you too. Do you think his work will become or is becoming more broadly known?
I think it's rather slow in becoming more well known. Exhibitions is the key thing for obviously people to see the art. So there was a big exhibition in 2011 at the National Gallery of Victoria, another one in 2017 at the Museum of Art Gallery of the Northern Territory in Darwin, which focused on early paintings, the 1971-72 paintings. There was the landmark exhibition in 2000 at the Art Gallery of New South Wales of Pintupi art. There's exhibitions happening in America as we speak through the Kluge-Ruhe collection. But I wish more Australian public institutions had Namarari's paintings and his contemporaries, male and female, on display, because it's a great way to learn about part of Australia's culture and history.
I couldn't agree more. So actually, I sort of jumped into questions without actually announcing. If you did have any questions, please put them in the chat now. And we will see that they are answered. But while we do wait for some questions, I believe there was a couple more things you wanted to mention, Alec, at the end of your talk? Or was that just the exhibition things?
Yeah, so the exhibition at the Drill Hall Gallery called Pintupi Way. So that's worth, people are able to get to Canberra to see the Pintupi art exhibition. I would say in terms of some follow-up, these will be on my resources list, but people can learn more about Papunya Tula art by going to the Papunya Tula website. People can learn more about the work of the dialysis service rather than having to type Western Desert Nanapawal Tjapaltjarri Judiku Aboriginal Corporation into your search engine. You can just put Purple House, and Purple House is a place worth donating to and supporting if that's your inclination. So they would be two ways of following up. And remember, I've got my resources list if you need it. And any questions, come in, Jade. Did I cover everything? I don't think so.
I think you may have, though, because we haven't had any other questions. So
Can I ask a question, please?
Oh, sure. And who are we?
I'm Bill.
Nice to meet you, Bill.
Going on to some chat thing, entering and putting a question is way beyond my capabilities. So
we've just got time. We've got 2 minutes, Bill.
The name of the fruit again, please, that was being painted with those dots.
Yes, akajiri. Do you want me to spell it?
Yes, please.
AKA.
Yep.
JIRRI.
Is that the same as a conker berry or not?
No, that would be different.
Yeah, I've got paintings with conker berries on them. Okay.
The Desert Park Zoo in Alice Springs, if you email them and tell them the name of the fruit or send a picture, they might tell you the Aboriginal name for it as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other spelling of the other name given to akajiri is Kamparapa, but I won't ask you to write that down.
I presume some art galleries in Alice Springs are better than others?
Yes. If you want to look for some Aboriginal art in Alice Springs, go to the Papunya Tula Gallery.
Good.
Oh, thank you very much, Bill.
Pleasure.
Was there any other questions before we sign off today? Last call. No worries. Well, in that case, I'm going to thank you again, Alex, so much for your time today and for working with us to make your talk online instead of in person.
Yes, thank you, Jade. That's all worked out tremendously well. Thanks to the support of the library once again. People want to know more about the book or about me, alecohalloran.com, and there's information there to order the book. Remember to get the free shipping.
Bookworms.
Don't forget bookworms. And that's for yourself and your friends, obviously, you know, watching who takes it on. And if I can give any other talks in the coming months, I'm open to do that for different groups. If you read the book or you've got questions or something that's not clear that's, you know, generated by just looking through the book, then just email. I love to hear from readers, and so I can respond to all that. There's about 75 of his paintings in the book. There's lots of his stories, which are probably the most interesting, but also his family and Papunya Tula art staff who knew him and admired him deeply. So there's a good combination of art history and social history, I think. And that's all I should say. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking, and I can see it's too long because my computer's telling me so. I've very much enjoyed being with you today, and thanks for coming along and spending an hour on thinking about Namarari's life. And I have much pleasure in telling the world about him. And thank you, Jade, for your initiative in making the whole thing happen.
Wonderful, thank you.
My
Thank you very
pleasure.
much,
Thank you,
Alec.
everyone.
Thanks, Alec.
That was very interesting.